Greetings, everybody. My name is Eddie Capone. I'm from Jamaica, and I came to the UK in 1961 as a 13-year-old boy, finished my schooling in Birmingham, and my parents moved to London, which I was so happy. I'm a second-generation Windrush, and when I came to London, I didn't want to get into the troubles that was happening in Brixton and Tottenham and Bristol. So I joined the army. So this is my first profession as a soldier. So my next profession would have been music. So I got into music, just starting as a roadie, as a driver, driving friends around to gigs and humping boxes and speakers and all sorts of things. And then I started playing. But my uncle in Liverpool was a jazz musician for many, many years. So while his brother and other families were fighting the war, he was playing music. And he played all over Liverpool for many, many years. And he was a big influence on me in getting into music. And I have to say, it's something that I really, really realized that I wanted to do. It wasn't so much at the time, I don't think I was thinking about the music so much, but I loved the lifestyle and all that goes with it. But over the years, those sort of conditions changed. And having many influences from the States, Jamaica. I remember one of my first roadie tour was Toots Hibbert and the Maytals' very first tour in the UK. And that was quite an experience. So I would say Toots is one of my influence in terms of reggae music. But then I moved into not so much reggae music, but more the soul and the funk. And because I was in that area of music, I was able to play with an awful lot of, at the time, still is, big names. Edwin Starr. He taught me everything about stage performance. Herbie Hancock, another influence on me. Benny Maupin, another influence on me. And I could go on into the history of my emergence into the music industry. But I'm very grateful for it because it has put me in a position to really engage with an awful lot of people who have helped to nurture my career. In so doing, I have learned that the things that have been, I would say, given to me, or the things that I was taught, I need to pass those experiences down. Because it's no use, in my opinion, dying with something without anyone's being able to carry on this legacy, and which is music. And back in the day, we were just recording on 4-track machines, and, it was an amazing apprenticeship because, we had to make do with what we had. We were rehearsing in people's bedroom, in their cellars, anywhere we could find, because there wasn't an abundance of rehearsal studios around. So we were rehearsing in pub rooms, shop basements, people's bedroom, anywhere we could rehearse where we could get away with playing drums, which made the most noise. So at this point, I am going to be speaking to one of our legends. Now, I'd like to introduce you to one of our first generation Windrush, Mr. Allan Wilmot. Where is your family from?
My family was originated in Jamaica, from St. Anne's. I was born in Jamaica on the 25th of August, 1925. And owing to the fact that Jamaica was a part of the British Empire, I was brought up as a British subject. And I, more or less, when the war started and Britain was in trouble and they asked the volunteers, I was around the age to volunteer, and I volunteered for the Royal Navy, which I served on the HMS Hawking for a couple of years. And later on, they asked for volunteers now for the Irish Rescue Service, RAF, Irish Rescue Service. And I took the opportunity of applying and was accepted and proceeded to England and did my motorboat crew training in the Irish Rescue Service of the RAF.
What was the black community like then at that time?
Well, in those days, you come and you hear about Great Britain and you hear about England, so you have so many things on your mind, and everything was so strange because every day you really get a shock. You build up certain things beforehand, and when you go there, it's a different thing because we felt that come to England, we were part of the British Empire. We were all coming to be accepted. But when we came here, the people of this country knew absolutely nothing about us. And in respect, our school curriculum was all British. We knew everything about England and the British Empire and everything, but the people here knew nothing about us. So we had a very hard time in convincing them that we were educated enough, because in those days, to be in the RAF, you have to be at a certain education. And their first thought seeing us that we are from the jungle. You know, we had tails, but coming to England, we cut the tails off. Of course, that was the propaganda, floating around. But after a while, they found out that we were all educated fellas. And the scene, gradually they realized what everything about. And they were so happy that we left our warm country to come here to help in the hour of need. Well, ERC Rescue is a special service of the RAF to rescue flyers who go on a job. They realize that they can't make it back wholly, and it's best to ditch in this river or the channel. And our job now was to go and pick them up before they get frozen to death, which, according to record, we have saved nearly 17,000 lives were saved, because if they're trying to land on land, it's more dangerous. But with the water, you stand a better chance of survival. And we picked up every nation you can think of that decided to ditch. Even our enemies, we picked up our enemies. Yes, well, when the war finished, they were in a hurry to get us back to our own country, But the thing about it is that the British government thought that it was the Jamaican government's responsibility to look after our rehabilitation, but nothing was done for us. And when I went to Jamaica and saw the situation, I said, it's going to be very tough ahead. Fortunately, I made an application for the Custom and Excise Service, and they accepted me. So for my time in Jamaica, until I decided to come back to England, I was in the services. Well, in those days, you felt more or less that you are helpless because getting transportation to anywhere, there weren't any aircraft transportation. It's only ships you got to depend on. Unfortunately, hour of the desperation, the Almanzuro, which was a troop ship, found that they were coming back to England with some spare cabins, and they advertised seats for £28.10, which was a godsend. And both of most of us who wanted to go back to England because we knew England was in a state of rebuilding and we would be able to start a life. And most of us came back to England. Well, that was the way out. That's the only way out. And the Almanzura was what we thought more or less we had a consent. Because can you imagine you're in Jamaica, nothing happening for rehabilitation, and you know that England is rebuilding. And if you get back to England, having been here before, you are more or less at home. But when we came back, into England clothes, it was a different cup of tea. The first thing, we couldn't get any accommodation because when you look around, all you can see the signs are the different hostels and hotels. No Irish, no dogs, no colored. Can you imagine how you feel after serving the forces and putting your life in the war and survive, and then you come and see that? For quite a while, I had to sleep on the underground, catch the last train, and sleep on the underground at the end of the line. Fortunately, some of the underground men were ex-servicemen and they had pity and lent us blankets and gave us a cup of tea. And that went on for a while because it was Christmas and everything was almost closed down. So we had to suffer those few weeks. Well, during that period now, there were quite a big political upstorm because the public felt that, well, the war is over and they gone home. What they come back for? Because they couldn't see through that you came here and it was necessary that you were here because there were so many jobs going, but they could offer you nothing unless it was some domestic thing, the broom job or sweeping up job and all something. And I had to wash plate just to survive at the Cumberland Hotel. I had to accept a job as a plate washer because I was guaranteed at least one meal a day and a few shillings to by that time now, the accommodation started to change because the early Irish immigrants, they realized now that they could rent their spare room out. And that was the beginning of changes. And then they realized now that these fellows were most mechanics and tradesmen that could fit in. And gradually things changed because they realize now, the government realize now that they have to do something. So suddenly I was called and offered to be trained as a postman. I was one of the first black postmen in London.
How did you get into music?
All the time I've been trying my luck on the stage because Emperor Wilmot is a born singer, and from a kid coming up in the RF, I used to do the BBC overseas programs. I used to take part in that. So I fancied myself to give it a try. During those days, anything colored or black entertainment was American. They had it all for themselves. And a friend of mine says, look, if we decide to go for it, we can do just as well as the Americans. So I got the job at the bookstore and I used to do the ordinary jobs in the nightclubs and life started to move along. So a friend of mine who came also and the Almanzuro, he's a musician, Ken Hunter, he realized that if he can form a quartet we could emerge as a singing quartet, and he started the Ken Hunter Quartet. Well, we ran for a while, but things wasn't too bright because we were always up against the Black American groups. They already have first preference. So after a while, I decided to pack that up. So I resigned, and I kept going. I kept going at the publishers, and then along came Edric Connor now, he's a Trinidadian and actor. He was one of the top actors at the time, and he got a contract to make West Indian folk songs because they realized that they didn't have any on records. So he heard or knew of our existence, and he contacted me and my brother, who was also in the RF and also a singer, and a friend of his, Frank Manor, and we started rehearsing with Edric. The record was such a success that they decided to have another one. Well, in those days, public appearance was the thing. And Edric couldn't appear without a quartet backing him. And he says, well, look, let's form a quartet to back me because I can't do it on my own. And that was the birth of Southlanders.
What inspired you?
Well, in the British music business, Ray Charles and Sammy Davis were Americans. It's all the world favorites. When I was a boy, I always heard the name Bob Hope. And we did a cabaret, and he was in the audience, and he had a show, a TV show, and he decided to put it on his show. And that was a big, big thing, in my life to really, with Bob Hope, meeting him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilmot. And it's been a great pleasure listening to your story. Now, this guy has made such an impact with his brand and style of reggae music, putting poetry and music in the same basket was just mind-blowing, and in particular, reggae music. But I'll let Mr. Linton Kwesi Johnson tell you exactly his story. So catch you on the other side. Where did you come from? Which country did you come from?
I was born in Jamaica in 1952. I arrived in England in 1963. I attended Tulsa Secondary School. I grew up in South London. I was educated at Goldsmiths University, part of the University of London, and I studied sociology there.
How did you get into music?
Well, music has always been a part of my life. I grew up in Jamaica. I was socialized into the folk culture of my parents' generation. I lived in a village, and we would listen to folk songs from the church, and as a child, like most country children, you'd be involved in festivals like Jankuno. I'd make my own little drum out of an old discarded milk can, and would also have fifes, make a little bamboo fife. So in that rural setting, I was socialized into the folk culture and the music that was part of it. Well, before I came to England, I spent a little time in Kingston with my mother, and of course you'll hear the music from the jukeboxes, playing rhythm and blues, American R&B, and early ska music. And when I came to England, I was, of course, listening to what was popular in England in 1963. Throughout the 60s. I bought my first record when I was 14 years old. It was a record called Hold Them by Roy Shirley. The music I grew up on was reggae music. Afforded the youth, the black youth of my generation, an identity which was denied us because, of course, we came here in a racially hostile environment. And even though we wanted to integrate ourselves into British society, there were barriers. So we more or less had to fall back on our own cultural roots. So the youth of my generation, it was rocksteady music and ska music and reggae. And
reggae never come in until the late 60s, wasn't it?
Reggae came in the old 60s. We're not going into the history of reggae. I'm talking about the music I grew up on. Reggae, rocksteady ska reggae, and of course, our whole cultural lives revolved around, as you know, the sound systems, which was the hub of our
community,
our culture of resistance, and that afforded us an independent identity.
Absolutely, yeah. As you're saying that, I'm just sort of like, concurring with everything that you're saying there, because it was a natural experience. So, what and who inspired you?
Inspired me as a poet or as a musician? Or
I think both, because that is what's unique about you, really, is that you've been able to mix poetry and music and really land it on the bullseye. Because there was nothing around when you were doing that stuff. I can't think of anyone. Can you?
Okay, well, my influences in poetry were many and varied. It came from literary culture as well as the oral culture. The orality came from, again, the folk culture in which I was socialized in Jamaica as a child. Word games that we played as children, nursery rhymes, skipping rhymes, riddles, and that old oral folk culture that most kids who grew up in Jamaica are socialized in. The oral influences also came from music. They came from the talking tunes of the early reggae DJs. People like Big Youth, U-Roy, Prince Jazzbo. And I was also influenced by the talking tunes of Prince Buster. Prince Buster made several talking tunes, including the famous 10 Commandments of Man. And in addition to that, as a youngster growing up in this country, James Brown. Because a lot of people don't realize James Brown is one of the godfathers of rap music. For example, that tune he made, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, he wasn't singing, he was actually rapping, talking, So that's the oral influence. The literary influences, there was a book called The Souls of Black Folk, which really wasn't poetry. It was prose, and it was written by an African-American scholar named W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was about the experiences of African-Americans at the turn of the century, in the period immediately following the abolition of slavery. And that is the book that really stirred something within me and made me want to write, to articulate how I felt about the experiences of young people, young Black people like myself, growing up in a racially hostile environment. And so later on, through one of my mentors, John LaRose, who founded New Beacon Books based up in Finsbury Park, I got to know about other Caribbean poets, African poets, and African-American poets. African poets like Christopher Okigbo, Caribbean poets like Kamal Brathwaite from Barbados, Langston Hughes, who was really a blues poet and a jazz poet. So these are some of my influences during my formative period.
Okay. So what was it like for you as a young man? Could you spend most of your time in Lambeth?
In Brixton, yeah.
In Brixton. What was it like for you? Because I'm sure that must have had some big influence on what was happening in 63, 64. Them time there was some really hostile thing happening in Brixton, wasn't there?
Yeah, my experiences were not any different from those of my contemporaries. You know, Black people at that time were marginalized. We were living on the periphery of British society. Yeah, my generation, we weren't expected to have aspire towards becoming doctors, lawyers, engineers, or whatever. We were supposed to do the same jobs, low-paid jobs that our parents were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at school when I told my careers master that I wanted to become an accountant. It was almost as though he was in shock. I mean, how dare you, black boy, from one of our colonies, aspire to become a professional? You having aspirations above your station. It soon became clear to us that the police had declared war against us. They had declared war against us. And that war has been going on up to this very day. Every single generation of black youth that has come after me has experienced that ongoing warfare. For my generation, it was sus when you were arrested for on suspicion of attempting to steal from persons unknown, which was called the sus law. For this generation now, it's stop and search. But, you know, racial harassment and intimidation and criminalization was the order of the day. And that is what led me into activism. I became a political activist. Racist and fascist attacks going on, the rise of the National Front, Enoch Powell demanding the repatriation of black people, and so on. I became politicized. There was a whole new movement of consciousness that came in the post-civil rights period, and that was Black Power. It was something akin to the Black Lives Matter movement consciousness that we're witnessing today. Back in my day, it was Black Power. And I became involved in a Black Power.
Angela and all them people. Angela Davis, wasn't it?
And I became involved in a Black Power organization called the Black Panther Movement. Now, the Black Panther Movement were an independent organization from the Black Panther Party in the United States of America, to which people like Angela Davis was associated. The Black Panthers in this country was started by a Nigerian called Obi Egbuna. He was imprisoned and deported eventually or something like that. But my organization in South London, based right here in Brixton, was the South London chapter of the Black Panther movement, was run by a woman called Althea Jones LaQuant. It was a period of awakening for me. I discovered literature. I discovered black literature because going to school, I didn't know that black people wrote books. But in the Black Panthers, we had a library, and there I came across books by people like, as I mentioned before, W.E.B. Du Bois, people like C.L.R. James, who wrote the Black Jacobins, about the first successful slave rebellion, which established the first independent Black Republic of Haiti in 1804. So I got some education and I began to understand my history. I began to have an historical perspective. And then we studied books like Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, which showed the important role that slavery and the slave trade played in the in the financing of the industrial revolution in this country. I hadn't studied poetry. I didn't know anything about poetry. So the only poetry in which I was immersed was the poetry of the Old Testament, the language of the Old Testament, because I used to read the Bible for my grandmother, who was illiterate when I was a boy in Jamaica. So everything I wrote was had thee and thou and thy and all that. And then I began to read other people, and I guess I would be imitating, subconsciously imitating whoever I happen to be reading at a particular time.
Mm-hmm.
Since I am of African Caribbean heritage, and I'm going to be writing poetry about the Black Caribbean experience in Britain, I should be doing so in that language, in the language of the people's experience about whom I was writing. So I began to use Jamaican speech, the Jamaican language. And one of the things that influenced me to go down that road was that I discovered an album in the Black Panthers by a group called The Last Poet. The Last Poets were doing African American poetry, oral poetry, sometimes accompanied by percussion, using the everyday spoken language of African Americans as a legitimate vehicle for their poetic discourse. And then I recall Louise Bennett, the Jamaican poet, who is the mother of Jamaican poets, who wrote in the Jamaican language. And Miss Lou, or Louise Bennett, gave me the authority to use my own spoken Jamaican language. Boy, Linton, your poems sound really musical. I could dance to your poems. A line of poetry would come to me with a reggae bass line. If not sounding like the actual bass line itself, acting as a foil. The bass line would be acting as a foil for the actual words. And then, so I wanted to write poetry that sounded like a reggae bass line, or followed the rhythmic contours. Over the years, that's how my poetry has developed. It has come out of that reggae tradition of the bass line being central to the rhythmic structure of the music. There's a guy, an English guy from Lancashire named John Varner, who was a guitarist, but he taught at Santley School in Brixton. And they were organizing events for the black kids that he was teaching so that they could relate to their own Caribbean, West Indian roots and all of that. John Varnum was working for Virgin Records on a freelance basis doing marketing. Virgin had become involved in reggae music, putting out reggae music. They got me to do copy for the adverts and to voice the adverts on the radio, and to write sleeve notes for some of the albums, Like I wrote the sleeve notes for the Gladiators album that they put out. So I said to John Barnum, I said, well, I write poetry, and people say it sounds like music. I would like an opportunity to make a record. Because I thought to myself, well, reggae would be the perfect vehicle to take it to a wider audience. So John Varnum said, all right, we're going to make, I'll give you £150. You can go to the studio in Wimbledon. We made this little demo, and he brought it and played it for Richard Branson. Richard Branson, who owned Virgin Records, it was his company at the time. No, we'd done the demo. We'd done the demo. Richard Branson liked it and said, do an album. Okay. So I got together with the bass player, Vivian Weathers, Winston Kerniff, guys I went to school with. And I had heard at that time that if you want to make reggae music and you wanted it to sound authentic, the only engineer who could record reggae music was a guy named Dennis Bovell. Dennis Bovell was working at Gooseberry Studio in Gerrard Street in Chinatown. So I got hold of Dennis, and we arranged to do the session. And I made Dread Beat and Blood. That was my first album. At the time I was involved in we were involved in a campaign with some people from up in Bradford. They'd formed an organization called the George Lindo Action Committee. We had a demonstration up in Bradford, in front of Bradford Police Station. And I was there with a megaphone because I'd written a poem called Dreading England to contribute to the campaign to free George Linton. I was there on the steps of Bradford Police Station with a megaphone chanting the poem. And they took a photograph of that. And that became the cover of the album. Then the next thing I knew, a guy named Dennis Morris, photographer, who was artistic director for Island Records, got in touch with me. In them days, I used to hang out some of the time with Johnny Rotten. I can't remember how it happened, but Dennis Morris came to approach me and told me that Chris Blackwell, the owner of Island Records, was interested in me. Dennis Morris arranged for me to meet with Chris Blackwell, and he said he liked Red Beat and Blood, and he would like to do a couple of albums with me. And I agreed. And so I did Forces of Victory and Bass Culture. Chris Blackwell then offered me a 6-album deal. And I said, no, thank you. Because that's not, I never envisaged myself as becoming a reggae artist as such. I had more academic ambitions. I saw myself in academia. I was interested in sociology and anthropology and economics and political science. Those were my areas of interest. So I said, no, I do one more album. Then I was getting invitation to do gigs in Germany and to do gigs here in England. So I became a reggae performer, just like that overnight. First gig, it was a baptism of fire. We played the Lyceum. The gig was sold out. We were the main act, and the opening act was Chalice. To me personally, it was a disaster. I couldn't hear properly. I couldn't hear the guitar properly. I couldn't hear the bass properly. The sound engineer who was doing the monitors, as I said, it was a baptism of fire. We got great reviews from it, and then the rest is history. So that's my life story. I can't, up to this day, I can't believe it, that for over 40 years, I've been able to sustain a career on the global stage as a reggae musician. But I want to say this, and this is very important. The secret behind my success is not the power of my poetry. It is the power of reggae music. That is the secret.
How do you see your legacy to the younger generation in terms of poetry and things? Because there's some young poets out there right now that are really writing some amazing poetry.
Yes, I think people can talk about that after I'm dead and gone. What I would say is that I've helped to give what they call dub poetry a name and a habitation in Jamaica. And I would like to think that I have given the generation of poets that came after me in this country the confidence to know that they could become poets, find their own voices, that they could find ways of articulating their experiences through poetry. I can only say that I hope the next generation would be able to look at Linton Kwesi Johnson and say, well, if that guy could become a poet and make a name for himself, I can do it too.
It's been an absolute education and a pleasure, madam, because over the years, seeing some of the stuff that you've really put out, it's been quite an inspiration for a lot of people.
And thank you very much, Linton, Kwesi Johnson, for taking part in this very special first time ever PRS event. And thank you very much, PRS, for inviting us to participate in this auspicious event. And I will leave you with this thought.
us can we stay? One God, one aim, one destiny. One God, one aim, one destiny. Let justice be done to all mankind in this time. If the strong oppresses the weak, yeah, confusion and discontent will forever mark the path of man. But with love, faith, and charity for all, yeah, peace will reign. Let it rain. Peace will rain. Let it rain. Peace must reign. Money in abundance, only at the top. Money in abundance, but none drop. Trickle it that trickle, but we can't get none. Trickle it that trickle, but we can't get none. Why? We can't get a blind. Why? No matter how we try, let it trickle down. We can't get a blind. Let it trickle down. We can't get a blind. Why? We can't get a blind. Why? No matter how we try, let it trickle down. Yeah. Let it trickle down. One God, one aim, one destiny. One God, one aim, one destiny. No one cares if we live or die. Working on the front line. The rhythm of life say you can't get away. You think, say you're safe, but you can't get away. Nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Oh, what a way to live. No more brutality. Redeem yourself, I say. Rise up and take your place. Rise up. Why? We can't get a blind. Why? No matter how we try, no more brutality. Yeah. Night and day I pray for peace. Let there be justice for all.